everybody. Welcome back to the Zonzij room. I heard a small yay. Yeah, we can do it. Yay, we're back again. I hope everybody's ready for our next conversation in our MozFest Dialogues and Debates series. My name is Jiva Kusenu, and I'm your host in this room for the coming 2 days. This morning, we kicked off the festival with an amazing talk and conversation by Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan, later joined by Mark Sermon, Mozilla's foundation president. And I left the room with so much to think about. Who was here this morning as well? Yeah, lots of you. Quick question, what was one big takeaway that you had from the session this morning? I can't remember who raised their hand. Somebody like you, right?
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway was that it threw me for a bit of a loop how the conversation was not focused on like social media specifically, but how it just kind of took us to like, you know, change starts with you. And now, no matter how cliche that sounds, I kind of proved that that is true. I think that was my biggest takeaway from this morning.
Yeah. Really nice point. And I don't know if anybody took a meditation session. No, not yet. Well, tomorrow. We did it together. Was pretty intense, right? It's not just a meditation session. Yeah, we went really deep. It was like a lot of breath work, and I came back feeling so refreshed. Yeah, and Jessie is agreeing with me. So tomorrow, 9 a.m., there's another one of those. So definitely be sure to check that out. Anybody else did a fun thing this morning that you'd like to share? Okay, well, anyway, we're doing a fun thing right now because we are in for a great session. This time it's about the intelligence of voice and volition. And I'm especially looking forward to this session because as a presenter and as a singer, I'm super fascinated by the way we communicate with each other, by the way we use our voices. And we are going to listen to 3 fabulous artists that will explore how voice and language shape the technologies we create, but also what we lose with having to engage with these technologies. So Bob Alotta, Vice President of Programs at Mozilla Foundation, is a veteran movement builder and nonprofit executive, working at the intersection of technology and communities, and she will be moderating this conversation. So I'm handing the stage over to you.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited for this conversation today. I think what feels so exciting about this conversation is the opportunity, we're calling it the technology of the living. And I think that so much of the work we do can seem disembodied. It could have the proclivity to be disembodied. It could be divorced from histories. And of course, it isn't ever. And the impact of it isn't ever. And so this is an opportunity for us to be in conversation with 3 amazing artists who think about living, who think about voice, and who think about the activity and action behind all of those things as mediated offerings. So, without further ado, joining me on this panel, Ethel Tawe. Ethel is a multidisciplinary artist, writer, curator, and creative strategist exploring memory and identity in Africa and its diaspora. Welcome. Kosisochukwu Nnebe is a Nigerian-Canadian visual artist. Her practice is invested in unraveling the process of racialization and rethinking the politics of Black visibility. Thank you and welcome. And Toshi Reagon, singer, composer, musical director, librettist, and multi-instrumentalist rooted in Black American and African diasporic musical traditions. And before we begin, just so you know, we'll be taking questions from the audience after our conversation. So please do think about what you would like to bring into the room. And before we kind of leap into a conversation, I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about your work and bring your work into the room. So Ethel, do you want to kick us off and share a little bit about what you do and how you'd like to bring it into this particular conversation?
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Like Bob said, my name is Ethel Tawe. I'm a multidisciplinary artist originally from Cameroon. My work investigates memory, identity, and what I call ancient futures in Africa and the diaspora. So I'm interested in image-making practices, storytelling, time travel, as means to sort of access these memories, whether sonically, visually, or haptically. I was part of MozFest and Mystica Freaks showcase last year on ancestral intelligence, where I presented parts of an ongoing body of work titled Image Frequency Modulation, which looks at the ways in which radio technologies can be metaphors for connectivity across the diaspora, beginning first in the home, in the body, in the Black interior. So I'm thinking about essentially, frequency modulation is the encoding of information in a carrier wave. So I'm using that as a metaphor to find ways in which transmission, or these acts of transmissions, are present in African cultures, especially through oral tradition. So I spend quite a bit of my time here in the Netherlands, so it's great to be here with people from all over and those tuned in online as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Kosi, will you tell us about your work?
Yeah, would it be possible to actually show that clip?
Sure.
In advance?
Ovinanam Gigi. How do I say, but I want to be able to speak Igbo with you? No, I want to go back. Obu Nanam Gigi. Mana. Achom. Kamuna is Igbo.
Anana, how do I say, I wish that I could speak to you in Inuktitut? Inuktitut kata katigi yunna koyamagit.
Thank you. So my name is Kosisochukwu Nnebe. Kosisochukwu means as it pleases God in Igbo. I was born in Nigeria and I moved to Canada when I was 5. And so much of my childhood, adolescence, adult life has been spent really grappling with what it means to have left my home country and moved to North America, and what it means to become Black, because that migration is one that really brought me to encounter Blackness in a very particular way, and to live Blackness and to understand it as something that is an imposition in the ways in which it's experienced in North America. And so much of my practice has been spent unraveling that process of racialization, that process by which one becomes Black. But at the same time, in my more recent work, I've been trying to reconnect with the place I left. And so wanting to connect to Nigeria, to those homelands. And that was inspired in part through work I was doing with the Canadian federal government, where I was engaging with Indigenous communities in Canada. And so through that process of engagement, I was made aware of non-Western worldviews and how one can inhabit those worldviews, how one can continue to live them, and to breathe life into them, including through language. And so in Canada, there is a huge effort towards language revitalization amongst Indigenous peoples. And that made me start to question why it is that I can't speak my own language, and to really try and understand what is lost when we lose that ability to speak our mother tongues. Mm-hmm. And so my work is one of being in relation with Indigenous communities as a way of building anti-colonial solidarities. And so what you see in this video is myself and a friend of mine who's an Inuk artist, so an Indigenous artist, trying to speak to one another in our mother tongues. And neither of us can do that because of different forms of colonial policies. Different forms of colonialism, right? So in Canada, I was brought into a settler colonial project that I was very complicit in because I was literally representing the federal government and going into these communities. But at the same time, the reason why I'm in Canada, my own history of displacement is also one of colonial violence and a colonial legacy in and of itself. One that continues in the form of neocolonialism, which is why a lot of African parents don't even teach their children their mother tongues. So in Nigeria, there's a huge issue of people not actually even being able to speak their mother tongues, even though they grew up in the country, in the cities. And so that is in part due to neocolonialism, this idea that English is what will open the doors for you, right? And this kind of valorization of the English language over others. And so this attempt to kind of come together and encourage one another to speak those mother tongues that we have lost is one of dreaming a new world in which we never lost them in the first place, and in which we can actually continue to give them and transmit them to the generations that come. And so it's an act of Black and Indigenous futurity building in a way to imagine an otherwise future for us and for the generations that come. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Toshi?
That was amazing. Both of you. I'm a musician, I'm a composer and a singer, and I love to collaborate with people who do a lot of different things. I'm also a producer, curator and presenter. From a very young age, my mother told me to learn the skills of being a producer so that I wouldn't have to wait for somebody to say it was my time to do whatever it was I needed to do, so I could just do it myself. So I've been producing my own projects since I was 17. The project that we're kind of in collaboration with Mozilla is Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower, opera I made based mostly on her novel Parable of the Sower and a little bit from Parable of the Talents. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Now.
Thank you. I mean, let's, maybe we can start off with the idea of sonic technology, the technology of sound, and the role it plays and has played in, Toshi, you often talk about the transportation. And so in this reclamation of language, in this imagining forward, maybe you can also share a little bit about the how you think about song as a technology, and specifically the function it's played for Black people across the diaspora.
Sure. I mean, I don't even know that it has to be song. I think it's, I would say vibrations. Sometimes when you say songs, people were like, I don't sing. They get very specific about things. And then some people can't hear sound, and some people can't say something that we could sonically hear. So I go to vibrational state where I think most things come from for humans, no matter the capacity of their bodies. And I think a lot of humans are put in states where they don't have access to the capacity of their body. So how do they survive those situations if they do? And so I think the transportation of sound or vibration is the way that we locate home. It's the way that we start to learn where we are. It's the way we start to identify, safe zones or like new zones or unsafe things by the sound of the people near us, by the sound of whoever raised you in whatever situations you were raised in. And I think all of that technology of the way that people will call you. So my grandmother had a voice that was like, she's in the room next to you. She had another voice if she was in the kitchen. She had another voice if she had to call you more than once. And it was like, she had a voice when you were at the end of the road. In New York, my father lived in West Beth Apartments, and we were allowed to go anywhere of the sound of his voice. And so we heard him, and he wouldn't say any names. He'd just be like, hey, and his voice was so distinctive. We would run back from wherever we are. All of that does something to all of us. It becomes a development, I think, of our systems, our maps, our ability to like take in other kinds of information, and and I think it's become in these. It's so interesting to me. One of my big, if people know me, they know it's not that I don't like the technology of streaming. I don't like the false economy of it, and how much it is transformed. The way that people can make a living. But I was like, it has no doubt to me that every time someone tries to introduce something new, they want to attach a sound to it. They want to say, like, this is how you can have it because it's sonically available. And then that's the door. That's the hello. Here is a phone that can play your music, or here is something like this. So it is really vital, transportation and technology, I think, especially in these weary times and dangerous times. There's a lot that you can do with it. It's very transformative and adaptable.
I'm throwing out questions, but also I really want to encourage this is a conversation. So you can please feel free to ask questions of each other and me for that matter. But I'm curious if you want to add anything to that. Or the other thing that came up deeply for me, and so I'll put it on the table, was the idea of longing and like the reconciliation of longing and technology too. Yeah.
I think what Toshi shared about bringing sound back to home really resonated. This idea also of mother tongue, right? The language you hear when you're young, the language you grow to know, most of us. With the project I mentioned earlier, which was, we showed little bits of it, the idea behind that was looking at my father's relationship to sound as a radio host and now an interpreter, and just thinking how he's always had this very interesting, like intuitive, like also an intuitive musician, so he just kind of picks up things and plays, and this natural rhythm that he seems to have was always really fascinating to me. So I started thinking a lot about oral tradition and the passing on of that as a transmission, as a radio technology in a sense. So we started to record proverb recitals in my mother tongue, also as a way to re-engage and relearn my mother tongue, Limbum, Cameroonian mother tongue. And specifically because Limbum is so tonal, so any slight change in tone completely changes the meaning of the word. So it's very, like the letters B-A can mean 50 different things, literally, depending on how you say it. And I always found that really fascinating because I would often make mistakes when I'm speaking, and he would always correct me. You have to kind of be precise in this way when you're speaking my mother tongue. So it was also this exercise in creating a future archive, right? And because a lot of this language is being preserved in written forms, and I always found that kind of intuitive to the language itself. So I kind of wanted to create this sonic archive, so passing that on as well as he's transmitted to me, what can I offer as a future ancestor, I guess, to those, especially for myself, where this language is sort of dying out. It's a small, tiny dialect, and ways of preserving it that way started to really fascinate me. And then, again, thinking about this tonality and other forms of non-written language, and thinking about like the talking drum also in African cultures as this language that is not textual, it's not finite as well, and other systems that kind of carry history forwards, whether it's like our naming systems. I know throughout the continent there's different ways, whether it's like day of the week, you're named after the day you're born, or other forms of passing these names forward, I think is also a technology or a language of sorts. So I think really for me, I've always been fascinated about thinking about sound from home, from I guess the beginnings, and kind of expanding from there.
I find this panel super interesting. I'm super grateful to be in conversation with everyone. There's just so much that resonates. So the title of that video that I shared is "The Ancestors Are Meeting Because We Have Met." And it starts off actually with my father performing a libation, which is a prayer to the ancestors. And he starts off by saying, I'm going to do this prayer in Igbo because that's the language that God hears most directly and the ancestors hear most directly. And so that's something I've been thinking about. It's not true, it's something that he just came up with at that time. But I've been thinking about what happens when we lose that ability to speak those languages because, like you said, they're so tonal. It's the same thing with Igbo. And so if you lose that ability, you don't know how to engage with the complexities and the nuances, and you don't have that precision, what happens to our ability to connect with the ancestors, right? There's a kind of spiritual disconnect that happens potentially.
Yes.
And I say that because my interest in language is in part informed by the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o is this Kenyan playwright who was famously jailed for actually writing a play in his mother tongue, Kikuyu, and becomes this fierce advocate of African indigenous languages. And for him, he speaks about language and the kind of colonization of language as the ultimate form of spiritual subjugation. And so we often focus on kind of physical violence, on economic violence and exploitation and extraction and all of that. But in order to really affect the mind of the colonized, he said that it's language that does that, because language is worldview. It is how you make sense of the world around you. And so once you disconnected people from their language, you have actually, that is what makes them captive. And so he looks at it from that perspective, but he also makes that kind of connection to spirituality that he doesn't really go into detail around, but I think is also really relevant, right? If we can no longer speak that language, how do we connect back to those ancestors? How do we connect back to those spiritual traditions? Because so much of that is housed in the language. And so I'm constantly thinking of language as a kind of counter-archive, where it's not an archive in the ways that we typically understand it, but it's one that actually holds the traces of non-Western and pre-colonial forms of knowledge, but also speaks to those changes, right? It speaks to those moments of cultural encounter and colonial violence, but is able to tell you about the past, the present, and also potentially give you a sense of what could happen in the future. And so I look at language as this way of reconnecting on so many different levels. And, you know, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his book is Decolonizing the Mind. And so I see language revitalization and restitution as an ultimate act of decolonizing one's mind, right? And so for me, it's really kind of on so many different levels, a really important act. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say something that's obvious, but we're in this moment where we're being, where artificial intelligence is taking up a lot of airtime, right? And many, and if not most of us, are dealing with or wrestling with the quandaries that emerge around artificial intelligence. I'm going to hold that word intelligence here for a second. They're predicated on large language models. I just want to say that out loud in the context of this conversation, because just even what each of you just said, what does it mean then to have these data sets, never mind, and that is another conversation or another point we can talk about of what it means to have data sets only in English, right? One of our projects, the Common Voice Project, is the largest open source corpus of non-English speaking languages, data sets of those languages. But what does it mean to flatten that intelligence to such a greatest common denominator that it is profoundly meaningless? Or maybe another way to put it, it cannot possibly replicate the alchemy that and the intimacy of a language that could in fact bring you home. So what is it that we're building for? And I think that that's what kind of part of the reason to be in this kind of conversation in this space, the distance between what we think we're working on and what we think we're not working on is collapsed. It isn't, that distance doesn't exist. It's it's a set of decisions and or a set of commodification.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, we hear stories about my parents and then my grandparents and then the ancestors before my grandparents. And I think that we live in a state of being terrorized all the time. And like, I don't know about your people, but maybe you have people have done similar things that my people did, was like adapt to have an understanding of freedom on their minds, like always, and then adapt every technology that was accessible to them towards that journey. And my family is sound technology, and a lot of priests, apparently, like back to the motherland, we are like priests and musicians in my family line on my mother's side. But that's like a lot of preachers in my family. But this understanding of weaving a path through the line of being terrorized that is based in the significance of love technology. My grandparents really, really loved their children. Really, really, I was the first grandchild. I'm the first generation that didn't pick cotton in the South in my family, which is a very significant thing. But one of the things I'm really trying to get to is how much we have been terrorized in my entire existence of living in this country, in America. Like, it's really a very exhaustive process of just constantly, like, putting you in danger or really doing terrible things to you, or stealing your people, or stealing your intelligence, or it is constant. And no matter how adaptive you become, this same thing cycles. I can't imagine that there's been a more terrifying time on planet Earth than this one right now, because it seems like all these systems of commerce and power know how to do is terrorize, that they cannot evolve outside of it. So I'm always like, when something hits the news at the same time globally, very loudly, so that everyone is talking about it, I am like, who the fuck did that and why? Because I was like, I've heard of AI for a very long time. I haven't actually been afraid of it. I've been interested in it. I'm sure I'm already using it. I'm sure it's already fun. I was like, what is about to happen? Like, why is this happening right now? Because we are having multiple wars for no reason. We are starving people. We can't keep up with the climate, yada, yada. We know all of the things. It's the most gigantic amount of ships heading someplace to steal people and take them someplace else ever in my lifetime. So I almost cannot discuss AI unless it's in the context of the terror attacks that are happening right now to everybody on the earth. And because I'm a singer and I communicate through the sound of my voice and the sounds of my body makes, I can tell you I'm terrorized all the time. I am like, and I'm working with Octavia Butler's work for the last 20 years, and I'm going, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, all the time. So I don't necessarily think like AI itself is dangerous, but we just know what humans do on planet Earth, and I really would love to think about all of that at the same time. I don't want to separate out AI, because I'm like, I think that's what you almost kind of like this wave is about. Can you just think about this AI thing so you don't think about like all of the other things that are happening in Sudan, and it almost is like AI is separate from Sudan, or AI is separate from the Ukraine, or AI is separate from the places, Somalia, AI is separate from what is happening in the U.S. In prisons all over the place. But it's not. It is the next technology that will drive all of those machines, and it already probably is instigated in it. And so I'm like, I'm interested in how to like, and I'm just gonna say it like this: how can we kill it if we have to? That's all. That's one thing I'm always interested in, because I was like, my people like kind of killed slavery because they had to. They didn't get it off the earth, but they shifted the economic system away from slavery, and they made something else have to happen. We've been being chased the entire time we've been in the U.S. To become enslaved people again. But I think about AI and I'm like, is it just so precious that we have to have it, or can we actually have the technology of decision making around it when we want it, when we don't want it, and things like that? And then if we had to kill it, like, how would we do it? You know? So that's my question for for all of us.
I mean, I think that's why volition, first of all, is in the title, right? How can we not be passive with what's happening? And how can we rename intelligence and not actually give that away as well? And so if we can accommodate the breadth of what is actually intelligence, and if we can not, this artificial puts us all, anything living away from it, right? So how do we actually say, no, we're going to be grounded in and this is, I think, a pinnacle moment, right? It's where it's rare to see the moments when the first regulation on something could come around. It's rare when we get to actually rally around something that isn't yet come. And you both talk about the past and the future in the same breath. Can you talk a little bit about that wrestling and that reckoning? Because in some ways, you're coming behind a colonial project long started, right? And insistent there's a future. So maybe if either of you want to talk a little bit about that and the way that you think about the technologies you've used and are in the process of using. One of the things you said in our first conversation was the work never ends, and I that could have come out of any of your mouths, right? So I'm curious how that sits in your bones a little bit.
Yeah, we were just talking about that earlier as well today, again, this iterated process. And I just want to comment on what you said, Toshi, about on diaspora, the Black diaspora specifically. And when I think of how much loss has occurred and continues to happen in the state of the world, and in the context of this conversation, thinking about sound and what was not lost in a sense, right, was sound, because it was embodied and it's something that was carried across the channels, across the waters, and remained and remains today.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting to think about that as in the context of also syncretic practices that I think a lot of the diaspora, the Black diaspora, continues to do. So whether that's the way religion was preserved in places like Cuba and Brazil, or even on the continent, the way with Creoles and Pidgin in our language. I think there's something very interesting about syncretism and the syncretic practice as a technology as well, as an iterated technology that never ends and continues to shape, shift, and change and adapt as necessary. I think there's a lot we can learn from that.
Yeah, that's like, let's actually hold that for a second.
Yeah,
like, that's actually really, really special to think about. And I really want to urge folks, probably some of what you're hearing are things that have come out of your own mouths, and some of them are things you haven't necessarily ever thought about. And so wherever you sit in that spectrum, we're making those dialectical decisions all the time in our work, if we're builders or engineers or anybody we're thinking about this work. So I do want to, like, that idea that there's a syncretic iteration and that evolution in an ongoing way, and what it means to have to, you kind of talk about that kind of, whether it's the vibration is passing through the body, so what does it also mean to have to input that as code or input that, right? That's a really interesting way to think about data sets coming together as that syncretic iteration. I understand. Look, we're in Amsterdam, so I understand, like, that there's so many histories and there's so many opportunities to have this conversation from so many different points of view, and that's a deep truth. So we get to sit in the truth of that. It's really deep to think about those things in context.
Yeah, I'm always interested in language as a technology in and of itself, right? And so really coming just back down to the fundamentals of it, of how it acts as a filter and how it kind of shapes and determines what it is that we see and what it is that we don't see, right? It literally does that work of an algorithm in and of itself, foregrounding certain things and then making other things very hard to see or hard to kind of conceptualize. And so when you start to think about that relationship between language and worldview, language and cosmology, you start to really understand what's being lost, even in terms of the kinds of possibilities that we make possible for ourselves. And so the engagement I've had with language has been through my own mother tongue. So Igbo, and what I'm going to share is common across various languages, but Igbo doesn't have any gendered pronouns. And so you don't have he, him, she, her. Like, it's not something that exists in the language whatsoever. Yes. And so you have this huge difference between a language like Igbo and then a language like Spanish or French, where gendering is so prominent within the language itself that a table in and of itself is gendered, right? And so that tells you so much about a society.
Yes.
Right? And so when you look at Nigeria and you look at the way in which gender was literally invented, right? Because it was an imposition of British notions of gender that were brought to Nigeria, you can look at the language itself and see that that is true, because the language doesn't lie. Right? And so that's what I'm talking about when I say that language is an archive. It's something that doesn't lie at all. And so another example is from Canada. An Indigenous language in Canada, from Ottawa, which is where I was raised, is Anishinaabemowin. And so instead of gender being such an important kind of aspect within the language as within society, what you're trying to understand is if an object is animate or inanimate. Right? And different objects, like a rock, can be animate. And one example that was given to me is a raspberry is inanimate, but a strawberry is animate. And so it's a very different way of seeing the world. And so when we're building technologies, when we're even just within academia theorizing, if everything that we're doing to create knowledge, to create new forms of technology, is always going through the interface of a language like English or a language like French, that in and of itself has these biases around gender, these biases around the kinds of relationality that are possible between a rock and a human person, right? In Anishinaabemowin, a rock is something that I can have a relationship with because we're both living, right? And we were talking about this in terms of African spiritual traditions and animism. When you start to do all your work in a language like English or French, you have actually eliminated so many possibilities that you weren't even aware of. And so when we start to bring these indigenous languages into things like Common Voice, into our data sets, what else are we making possible that we're on the verge of losing altogether?
Yes.
And so I think that there are actually like implications to that work that go beyond what we're actually trained to think through, because we're not thinking about what are those knowledges, what are those worldviews, what are those cosmologies, literally ways of understanding the universe that are housed within those languages.
Yes. That's a word. Yes. No pun intended.
No.
What do you think? When you talk about either leaving something as the ancestor of the calm, or calling back a song line that's been taught down from a very specific geography, or thinking about archive as a future archive, like what's the thing you long to know, or what excites you about that, or like how do you make sense of that in your present tense?
One time my mom tried to teach me this song, and it's like, that awful day will surely come, point it out, make haste. Will surely make haste. One of them is a call and one of them is a response. Yeah. No, that's what it's about. But it's that awful day will surely come, pointed out, make haste. It's like this, it's going to happen. Like, come on. And I think about that as a body of it's almost like a bag in my pocket that I have all the time. It has other things. That has another line about when I stand before my judge and, have to say who I am and what I did, and then, when I stand, it has all of these different technologies of meeting conditions that are so horrific. You are like, good Lord, like why? But at the same time, there is such reverence for being alive. And then there is a creation of a journey to death that you actually control no matter what is happening to your body. So the intention is so epic to me that I was just like, wait, they did all of that, right? They were like, here is where we are. This is what's going to happen. So they way past, this is like generations of seeing it. So you don't even actually necessarily see, someplace else. You're like, this is what's going to happen to us right now. And when that happens, you want to get yourself together because you're about to go someplace else. And your opportunity to not be in this place or take this place with you when you go is at hand. What you gonna do about it? It's living and existing in two different areas of possible existence. And they're both alive. There's no separation between the flesh and the spirit. It is like things might happen to this. However, we know we are going over there. And so how are we going to operate this system to get there? We're going to get there somehow. We're pretty sure it's not going to be on our terms because we have lived and witnessed and we understand where we are. It's really a song that when you sing it in congregation, it's multiple voices, it's all ages of people singing. It's very high voices, it's low voices, it's, voice. It grinds on the bottom of something, and then it comes up again. You feel the surrender of this life when you sing that song. And you feel the power and fear simultaneously of what it means to dare to live in the transportation of freedom or escape, which means you're dead. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they did it, but that is like kind of what I carry with me all the time. Like these hard truths that are using this particular language, but are placing them in the body where the language evolves into a sonic resonating and agreement with the spirit, with the heart, with the complete environment that you're in, that you actually live in possibility all the time, and that you have intention to say where you're going and get there. I have always found that to be one of the biggest gifts of my life. And I hope I pass it on and keep it moving as a system, as a transportation, as technology.
Call and response can happen right here. It can happen in a split second. It can happen across generations. And when we're talking about how are we utilizing the technologies that are available to us and talk about bending time, that is time bent. And so in the same way that the work that we do and build upon, it's always built on precedents. right? Laws are unprecedented, right? Which means human possibility, it's precedent. It means the time it takes for you to move from one, it's precedent. And that's always bringing the past forward. So that I think we get free in just simply knowing it's already true. Which also means we can build something beautiful, right? I mean, that's the other thing. Know where you are, know what's coming, know what's happened, know where you want to go, and what choice you're going to make right now, right? Because a call and a response also assumes I'm going to say a thing and you're going to hear a thing. And that's a deep giving. Tell me what your eyebrows are saying.
I'm thinking, I like what you said. Call and response is that someone says a thing and then someone else hears the thing. And in the video, there's an exercise of translation that's actually impossible that I'm trying to do. And it's one where we're removing a common shared language as the thing through which we're understanding one another. So the goal is to imagine a world where I speak Igbo and Catherine speaks Inuktitut. And I understand when she speaks to me in Inuktitut, and she understands when I speak to her in Igbo, and we don't need to translate anything, right? And it's something that we can't really get to. But I'm wondering if AI is actually something that can help with that. And it is a question that I have, seriously, because when I go on to Google Translate, I can put something in Igbo, and then I could ask for it to be translated into Inuktitut. And I wonder, what is that mechanism? And is it going through a shared language like English, or is it a direct translation? And that's the future I want.
Yes.
That's the future I want. And it's there, but we're not thinking about it in the ways that I'm thinking about it. Right?
Or maybe.
And so I'm actually really interested in continuing this project using things like Google Translate that allow us to rethink how we think of translation. Right? And how we can embody that form of translation that we see on there. And
that is a collapsing of time too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You said we don't have to go to this place.
No, we don't have to go through English. English is what connects us usually. Right? English or French, right? Because it's that colonial experience. Right? And so even in the video, you see the impossibility of it, because for me to even be able to speak Igbo, I have to turn to my dad. My dad tells me, I ask him in English, how do I say this? And then he tells me in Igbo how to say it. Right? And so you see that we're trying to get somewhere. And we know where we're trying to get, right? But we don't necessarily know how. But I'm wondering if that missing thing could be technology and AI. So it's something I definitely actually want to explore a lot more.
That's gorgeous. Also, there's that moment, I don't know if anybody else had it, but I wondered, I realized she was on the phone with, with a relative probably, right?
in Nunavut,
But for a split second, you're like, is it just going to tell her, right? Is it AI? Like, so there was this moment where and I was like, oh no, it's
someone else. But that's a good question.
Interesting.
So there is something there.
I think when I think of this transcending of time that I think we're all engaging with in our works, I think a lot about custodianship as well, and inheritance, whether we're inheriting songs, whether we're inheriting, in my case, I work with moving image and archival photographs. Just the aspect of care for these things, in how we present them, how we continue to embody them, how we understand them, I think is really interesting. So I think just this whole conversation has made me reflect on that. So,
do folks have any questions? Because it's time for questions. Yeah?
Yes. Thank you for the talk. Very inspiring to be with you. First, to comment this last part, I also saw the video and thought that, so nice that they have an AI in the voice of the ancestors that could speak.
That's so cool. That's an exploration.
Also how my mind and our mind is organized, because it was a better technology. We're the ancestors, not the
right.
And my question is related to that, of how you mentioned how language in English loses a lot of the quality of the vibration of the sound of when we are looking to these large models. but also how standardized time and how we go to this Western linear perspective of time. I'm from Brazil, and I came from this encounter of like to be in the Western perspective and also with the indigenous and African perspective of time there. And I would like to hear your perspective of how our interaction with AI can go in this syncretic evolution, as you mentioned, or the opposite, that we are going to be like, because of the way that the AI standardizes the information, standardizing also our linear, making more linear our way of thinking. Yeah, I would like to hear about that, because you also mentioned that for me was very important to how the knowledge from our families and ancestors don't come like linearly. Comes like in the murmurations, in the prayings, in the music, and it's along the life and not like in one line, right? So I would like to hear about it. Thank you.
Wow.
Should we take it
first?
Why don't we ask one more question and then we can answer, because I'm mindful of time. So Kuliwe, and then you guys can figure out how you.
Thank you. So my question, I think, is really based on issues around context and language. And I can't remember which one of you said or gave the example of the pronunciation of BA. But also when I'm thinking about the issue of translation on existing technologies now, the question is it literal or is it contextual? And when it's contextual and presented in a literal form and you get discord, what are we saying? And I think I'm asking this question particularly because of, just this whole conversation around AI and content moderation and the necessity of having the human face or someone who understands context. So my question for the three of you is discord good or bad? And when we talk about translation or understanding each other in the different forms on the internet, what do we do about discord? And can we get to a point where discord is good?
Thank you. Well, we could have a 3-hour discussion with both of those questions.
I know.
So there's the question of linearity and the potential, or the whatever the opposite of that is, or the potential to go in either direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want
No, go for it, please.
It's really interesting, and I can't get away from how violent humans are on the planet. Like every time, whenever people, both of your questions, I just am like, are we entrusting solutions to these people who have like never really, like in terms of building empire and societies? I literally don't know why the people who end up being in charge of vast things, as my friend Alexis Pauline Gums always says, if you believe they're in charge. Like if you believe Bill Gates owns all the farming land, the most farming land, if you believe these things. So I don't have a belief system for the violence and terror that we have to operate in. Like I don't hold them as like they are presidents and therefore they're great. They are this and therefore they're great. They are that because therefore they're great. And then when it comes to the independent conglomerates of people who have so much money currency that they get to be the leaders in creating a lot of the systems and technology and developing the technology, that even if somebody like sits in their room and develops something really cool, the eventual path is that they should get $19 billion for it at something, and it should be common for us to enter into conversation with it, which, by the way, is a mechanism for art. When I did Parable, I'm an independent producer. Nobody wanted to produce it. People wanted to know, when is Parable going to be Hamilton? That I was like, that's a racist white man that owned my people. Parable will never be Hamilton. I will never be able to put some black bodies on white people who enslaved us and have them tell a story that will raise billions of dollars worldwide. Right? Like, I was like, that's just not what I'm doing. I don't even know how it happened, but I know that it did. So I think, like, a lot of the questions about, like, this, the responsibility, or can we bring in, you know, more of the nuance of the and especially with language, and especially like the way we receive information, can we bring that into the scope of artificial intelligence? I am just like, why can't artificial intelligence just be artificial intelligence, and why can't we be what we are, and why can't they be in an alignment, a relationship? And the reason why I think it can't is because humans have never known how to do that since they've like arrived on the planet. That there's a lot of humans who understand it, but somehow we find ourselves in state of war all the time. And that we're in these groups where we're processing, and I know I'm like taking our time, I want to sum it up, but you can see how much it can keep going, that there isn't actually a sum up. But I am like, how do we address our desire for violence as human beings, and abuse and enslavement and destruction? It's literally, to me, the most important thing to work on, because whatever we create, however it is created, whatever source it comes from, a beautiful source, or like somebody in a lab trying to like blow up large amounts of land and people, we end up in a very violent conflict where some of us have to make decisions. Are we going to be violent people to help end the conflict? Or are we going to come over here and like be praying and doing other things? Like, what are the things? So I can't get away from our state of humanness on planet Earth. I can't. So every answer to some of the complexities of what we're trying to discuss is the new range of violence, which is quicker to evaporation of resources in the planet itself than it was like 300 or 400 years ago, when my people first came from across the big water. So I feel us in a very desperate place to kind of answer and like really have time to play with these questions. But I also just see like, but if these people don't change, or if we can't bring more of ourselves into the conversations, then we end up in states of war.
Mm. I mean, I think that's it, right? That
Yeah.
we have to bring more of ourselves into the conversations.
Yes.
I think that's precisely what we're trying to do, because that otherwise there's not an alternative, right?
Yeah.
We have to actually be the alternative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm mindful of time, but I want to give both of you a chance to say one other thing.
Yeah, I guess just to link that to your question as well about this bending of time, I think a lot about sort of, I don't want to say returning, but essentially returning to natural rhythms of time and natural cycles of time that kind of counteract this capitalist machine, this clock time, which is completely how the system you speak of is built on, seeing us as machines in a sense, right? And this hyper productivity. I think also to answer your question about if it's literal or otherwise, I think it really is a spiritual shift, if I could even say. I think it's a social shift. Do we trust the system that built it to also, I guess, fix the state we're in? Not necessarily, but I think we need to continue to kind of ask these questions and see more human and more spiritual ways to engage with it.
Absolutely. So what's interesting about this video, it's 22 minutes long, and one thing that you'll notice if you pay attention, and it's something I noticed upon reflection, is that Catherine and I speak at different paces. I'm much faster and she's much slower.
Interesting.
And so one of the things that happened when I was doing engagement with Indigenous communities is that you'd sometimes get these guidebooks on how best to do engagement, and one of them was like, speak slower, allow for more spaces of not speaking. Right? There are moments of silence, and don't rush to fill that silence, right? And it's literally a different temporality.
Yes.
That, like, you know, you're going in representing the government, you ask a question, you want that answer immediately.
Yeah.
So you can go back to Ottawa, you can draft your policy, and you can say it's done, right? And like,
yeah.
so sorry, I shouldn't be saying that, but like that's how it's done, and that's the problem. That's the problem.
Right.
And so in engagement, you're told slow down.
Yes.
And the way that, like, sometimes the way that people speak in different communities is slower.
Yes.
The pace is slower.
Yes.
You don't have to answer immediately. You can sit on something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so things like that are things that are just, you know, sometimes embedded in the language, other times embedded in how it's spoken. There's another thing that you'll see is that sometimes instead of actually saying something, she'll make a gesture. And so she'll like lift her eyebrows, and that's yes. Right? What are the other ways in which we communicate that are actually embodied?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's so many different things that kind of counteract and show you there's a moment in which you're actually being exposed to different worldviews and different ways of being, different ontologies as well, right? And so I find that really fascinating. But even with translation, like what you were saying is so true. Like it's also that like the context, if it's not there, then what is that translation actually doing, right? And so I think that's the whole... that's why we also need that kind of lived experience, and we need those living ancestors, because we can't just relegate everything to AI to hold the knowledge and be able to know what to do with it, right? So it's both of those are questions like I still need to sit with, so thank you so much. More to reflect on, but yeah, just great questions.
Right on. Okay. Speaking of time,
Yeah.
we're out of it. And so I just really thank you to each of you for joining us, and thank you for joining us. Can we give it up for the... We'll be back in this room for more dialogues and debates. And today at 5, please come and join Toshi, who'll be holding song circles today and tomorrow, so you can learn and sing with Toshi and experience more of technology within your voice and your body. And special thanks to the production team behind the scenes and our fantastic panelists. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob. We're in this room together and having this conversation. Thank you again. And we will be taking a short break.
Thank you so much.
To change up the settings, but be sure to be back at 3:30 to join Interledger and here to support for a fireside chat about the experiences of the digital finance system for marginalized and excluded groups, specifically undocumented persons. And also, come to the performance, the singing circle of Toshi and her big, lovely band. That is at 5. So for now, a quick break over here. So see you later. Thanks for joining, everybody.